Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Directors College. First, what I'd like to do is begin with a shout out and a thank you to our very good friends at Prudential Financial who are sponsoring this morning's breakfast. And it's really through this large web of affiliates and sponsorships, many affiliates and sponsors being, in the room for Directors College, that we're able to pull together an event of this sort. It really does take a village to do something like Directors College, and a very important part of that are people like Prudential and other very good, strong, long-term supporters. So let's have a big thank you, please, for all the support that really does make this possible. Now, one of the sessions that we traditionally have done at Directors College, and it's traditionally been one of the most popular sessions we do, is crisis anticipation and control. All right. Now, we have a theme. We have ideas about this that we've learned by talking to people really now for almost 2 decades, and that is that the vast majority of crises really shouldn't be surprises. All right. Most crises are predictable, and it's just that when it happens, you're not ready to manage it. All right, so people often mistake crisis for surprise. A small number of crises really are surprises, and that's a whole different kettle of fish. When you run any large conference, all right, of any sort, one of the crises that's entirely predictable is there's bad weather somewhere, and one of your speakers can't show up. All right? If you're running a conference and you're surprised, all right, and you have a crisis because of a no-show, all right, you don't know how to do crisis anticipation and control, all right? So unfortunately this year, because of weather and travel problems, we're unable to get the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court. And in that kind of a situation, what you've got to do is you've got to be able to fill in with somebody who is, and Myron, if you're looking at this tape, please forgive me, even better than the guy that you actually had before. Okay? And I think we've been able to pull that off. When you talk about corporate governance, not just in Silicon Valley, but when you talk about corporate governance nationally and also internationally, one of the names that keeps coming up again and again and again is Larry Sonsini. All right? Larry's been there, Larry's done that. Larry has, in fact, seen just about every crisis that can come up in the boardroom and has helped directors and CEOs and chairmen of boards navigate through some of the gnarliest situations that corporate America has ever seen. And when it comes time to look for someone to share wisdom, advice, and experience at Directors College, it's really hard to do better than Larry Sonsini. And ladies and gentlemen, I give you Larry Sonsini. Use the pajama line.
Oh, God, I'll never appear in Delaware again, but...
I'll never.
When he called me to step in, of course, I'm delighted to be here. So many of you I know, and this is such a great program, but I really did think of a lawyer joke that I had to get out to put everything in perspective. So there was a priest, a doctor, a lawyer, and a little boy that were taking a private flight. And midway through the flight, the pilot comes on and he says, "Look, we have engine trouble and you must bail out." And with that, the pilot bails out. And there the 4 of them were, and there were 3 parachutes, and the doctor speaks up, and he says, "Look, I'm a doctor. I save lives. It's important that I live," and he grabs a parachute and bails out. Next, the lawyer gets up. The lawyer says, "Look, I'm a lawyer. I'm the smartest guy in the world. Everybody should listen to me." And with that, he grabs a parachute and bails out. Well, the priest and the little boy are there. There's 1 parachute, and the priest turns to the little boy and he says, "Son, I've made peace with God. You take the parachute." And the little boy says, "No, Father, we have 2 parachutes. The smartest guy in the world just jumped out of the airplane with my backpack." And so what I wanted to do is be sure you understand the content of my remarks today. And I thought I would do a couple of things. One, I think that we are going through a major change and inflection point in corporate governance in America. What we have seen in the last decade just is not compared by any prior experiences of what's happening in boardrooms. The relationship between the three great constituencies of corporate America, management, boards, and shareholders, really has changed and it is turning upside down. And I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about some of the landscape, the 7 key concepts that have kind of brought this all about. And then talk about what are the current tensions that I see in the boardroom, and then end with 10 practical thoughts on how to think about all of this in the boardroom. So when you think about what's influencing the landscape, I think we got to keep in mind several things to keep it all in perspective. First of all, look what's happened to the status of stock ownership in this country. Quite frankly, almost 80% of all shares are held in street name. And 3/4 of street name shares are held by beneficial holders who object to the disclosure of their names. Most shares are held in street name. And at the same time, at a study we did at the New York Stock Exchange when I was on the commission there, we believe that trading activity results in almost 100% turnover in most corporations in America per year. So the shareholder base is dynamically different. Secondly, think of the size and diversity of the institutional shareholder today. The retail shareholder has almost disappeared. Index funds, EFIs, and the holding periods, the agendas, the level of activism of the institutions is very, very diverse today. There is no one shoe fits all. Thirdly, on top of that, we have to keep in mind the proliferation of derivatives, synthetic securities, and hedging transactions. Today, when I review a 13D or a 13G of someone who owns 5% or more of the stock, you really realize, if you dig into it, that some of that is held in derivative positions, puts and calls. Sometimes the actual voting stock held is much less. It's really a diversified base dealing with the dynamics of the marketplace. Fourthly, and you know this because we talk about it at this conference all the time, is the influence of proxy advisory firms. Basically, largely unregulated institutions that oftentimes have no economic interest in the stock that they are basically recommending voting about. And then, of course, you have the politicizing of the boardroom, something that Joe talked about a year or two ago. The politicizing of the boardroom, at least 4 things I can think of right off the bat. You know, the limitation on broker non-votes, we've talked about that. That, you know, if the beneficial holder is not dictating how shares should be voted, those votes are not voted in uncontested director elections anymore. The majority voted in uncontested board elections. We've grown up with a regime that believes in the principle of plurality. We must have a board of directors, so if you get more votes than anyone else, even less than the majority, you're in. Not so today. Almost 70% of corporate America has one form or another of majority voting, and that is not by law, that's just by activism. Proxy access, we talk a lot about it, but the fact of the matter is shareholder proposals now can put that on the table. And of course, look what's happening on things like executive compensation, say on pay, for example, clawbacks. The politicizing of the boardroom on top of all of this. And then, of course, you have the scrutiny of director independence. We're in a world of contextual independence. It isn't check the box anymore. You may be independent for one issue, you may not be independent for another issue. You know, educational institutions that you support, philanthropy that you support, politics that you support or deny could affect your independence on an issue in a boardroom. And lastly, you've got the growth of what I call federal regularization or the federalization of corporate law. The federalization of corporate law, the regulation that we have, starting with Sarbanes-Oxley, look at Dodd-Frank, if you will, and drill through all of that. You have a shifting of regulation that is creating perhaps a risk of a mentality of one shoe fits all. Well, these are many of the dynamics that have been going around, and how you mix those up really influence the landscape. And all of this creates tensions in the boardroom. And, you know, I ask myself, what are the real tensions that we have to deal with? Well, first of all, we've got to put on the top of the list shareholder activism, because activism has changed. Almost every institution is an activist in one form or another today. We are moving from a director-centric governance model to almost a shareholder-centric governance model. And stop and think about the tools that shareholders have. We've talked about broker non-votes. We've talked about the prevalence of majority voting. But this activism is really multifaceted, and it is not necessarily short-term. A lot of it deals with long-term issues. It's an issue-driven, contextual activism today that permeates relationships between boards and shareholders. The shareholder voice in the boardroom has gotten louder, and that is creating a tension with traditional metrics of board agendas and board dialogue. What are we going to do about that? Another debate and another tension is one we've always seen, but it's changed, and that is the tension between long-term value creation and short-term value creation. Now, we all know as directors that we are told that the job we have is to build long-term value. But given the economic landscape that we have gone through, given the volatility we have in the market, and given what technology is doing to companies and industries, technology has become disruptive today. It is disrupting long-term shareholder plans. It is disrupting long-term board of director plans. And this is creating a tension of what is short-term value and what is long-term value? And what constituency am I supposed to serve as a director? A third debate, and a growing tension, deals with a greater emphasis on shareholder communications. What does that mean? Well, the truth of the matter is, proxy statements are getting thicker. You know that. How many of you can really plow through the compensation discussion in a proxy statement? Annual reports are getting thicker. 10K reports are getting more verbose. Risk factors take up sometimes 50% of the typeset. And is that really shareholder communication? Why isn't that working? Because that's not the communication that's required. Does it mean more transparency on what long-term value creation means? Does it mean more access to the boardroom by shareholders? Does it mean that boards of directors have to do road shows about their jobs? It's a debate. Another tension, the fourth in my view, is when and how to use structural defensive measures. When do you ever talk about defensive measures anymore? Staggered boards, poison pills, denying shareholders the right to call special meetings, denying shareholders the rights to act by written consent. Has that all disappeared? Only about 150 of the Fortune or S&P 500 have poison pills today. It's almost a war zone if you bring that up with a shareholder. But is that really true? What is the role of a defensive measure? What's our job as directors in defending against a long-term value creation plan when there's short-term pressure? A fifth tension, of course, you know this one. It pops up all the time. Executive compensation. Tying compensation to performance. It really is becoming the new window to the strategic plan of the corporation. What's really going on is shareholders want to see more of what the game plan is to build long-term value and how that translates into short-term value demands. And a good way to do it is put pressure on tying compensation to performance and publicizing what that performance is and holding people accountable to it. It really is more, in my judgment, about value creation and strategic direction than it is about compensation. And I think that's going to continue to evolve. And isn't it interesting that we've got federalization coming into the mix, of all things, putting the government in the middle of compensation and value creation. Another key tension that we have to deal with that's also in the mix is this whole increased focus on succession planning. Now, we've talked a lot on succession planning. Cy and Joe have put that on the agenda for the college and done a hell of a job with that. But to me, succession planning has gotten broader. It has become a part of shareholder agenda. Look at the Wall Street Journal. Notice the pressure and changes in CEO tenure based upon shareholder activism and the voice of shareholders. Look at what Jamie Dimon has been going through. Succession planning is getting beyond the boardroom. Succession planning is out there, and it's going to be out there more and more. And when you stop and think about the other tensions, when you stop and see the pressure upon building long-term value, shareholder activism, and you match it with compensation philosophy, you begin to see the transparency and the shift to the shareholders of more of governance that we deal with today. And another growing debate, kind of my seventh tension, deals with having to bring management more into corporate governance. What does that mean? Many people, when we got onto the corporate governance bandwagon, believed that we had to form special committees of the board, independent directors, and don't talk to management about governance. That doesn't work. To me, it's an oxymoron. The people who are going to run the company and execute the plan have to be a part of governance. There's got to be a definite symbiotic relationship with the board and management on that. Yes, there has to be a constructive tension between management and the board to really foster candor and objectivity. But management has a critical role in governance, and we as directors have to figure out how to play that and yet do our jobs and address the demands from the market. The themes, transparency, trust, and integrity, all are a part of the mix. And then, of course, there's the tension and debate about risk management. We all talk about risk management. Notice the growth of risk factor disclosures about risk management. Many companies believe they have to have risk management committees. What is that all about? Is that anything new? It really isn't. It is true that necessary steps must be taken to foster a culture of risk-adjusted decision-making throughout the organization. It's really about risk-adjusted decision-making in my mind. And the board must be sure that the top executives are fully engaged in risk adjustment metrics in dealing with the strategic plan. It's not about identifying what the potential catastrophes are. As Joe indicated, the crises are obvious. It's really how to layer the mix of the tone of risk-adjusted decision-making from management to the board. It's so important to deal with that tension. And then lastly, we have to deal with the federalization of corporate law. I keep coming back to that. It's a little bugaboo of mine. One size fits all against all these other tensions and debates is a disaster. How many times do you go to a board meeting and you look at your agenda and you're just going through lots and lots of detailed process? And how much time do you actually focus on where are we going with this enterprise, what are the risk-adjusted risks, and do we have the management team with the quality to execute the plan? How much candor is there? And I think the federalization of corporate law really is causing us to lose some fundamental principles. What is corporate governance? It's not corporate governance for the sake of corporate governance. It is about sound oversight of management and management objectives to create long-term value. It is about an atmosphere of sound business ethics and integrity. It is about sound decision-making processes and independence and objectivity. It's not about committees, it's not about checklists, and it's not about satisfying shareholder demands for the short term. These are the debates. These are the tensions. And so you got to ask yourself, with the changing landscape in governance as I outlined, and with these tensions and debates, how should I look at my obligations as a director? What are the practical things I ought to think about? Joe called me up last night and he says, if you say anything, be sure you get practical. So I thought about what are the top 10 things that make sense to me in dealing with all of this change. And you know what? I think they're all obvious to you, but sometimes it's good just to check them off. First of all, number one, process matters. Process matters. Courts are ill-equipped to determine whether the actions you take as a director are good substantively for the company. They're ill-equipped to do that. But they are very adroit at reviewing the process you went through to get there. Process is critical. And as you often hear when we review fiduciary duties, we focus on the key themes. Be well-informed, be deliberate, and be inquisitive. Process does matter. Secondly, I think board agendas are out of whack. Quite frankly, I think there are only three things you need to spend most of your time on. This may be controversial, but I think it comes down to this. Number one, the company's strategic and standalone plan. That's our job. Do we really understand the strategy of the company to build value? And I must tell you, it's getting to be a more difficult question because, as I've indicated, technology is disruptive today. Business plans used to have 3 to 5 year horizons. If you're in the technology industry, maybe you've got 6 months. And that requires constant evaluation. Secondly, in looking at a strategic plan, it really comes down to what are the risks and what are the assumptions. What are the risks and what are the assumptions? Are key questions that have to constantly be asked. And then lastly, I think the third thing you have to focus on besides those two is the quality of management to execute the plan, concluding a focus on talent development and succession planning. That's our job. Of course we have to set the tone at the top, but that's our job. And I think you have to take a long-term view, recognizing that in today's world, with the economic headwinds, with the globalization of economies, with the emergence of other economies, and with technological change, the horizons are shorter. Number three, understand and respect the distinction between the board's role and management responsibilities. This is a risk. What's happened in the boardroom is a lot of reaction to these changes in the corporate governance landscape and shareholder pressures have caused many boards to knee-jerk and be more involved in management. Oftentimes, the tendency is, in order to execute on my fiduciary duties and to do my job, I've got to manage. No, that's not our job. Our job is really to reach agreement on the strategic plan, assess risk, select the CEO and be sure that you've got the right management team. Ensure a high-quality management team succession plan is working. Assure compliance with ethics, integrity, and tone at the top. And basically provide advice and support. It's too complicated to manage the business. And yet, there is a dilemma, because if you read the corporation code of many states, take Delaware, it will tell you the duty of the board of directors is to manage the enterprise. But it doesn't mean that in today's world, and there's that constant confluence of tension. Number 4, you've got to set up systems to oversee compliance and risk management. Quite frankly, I think that many failures with strategic plans are a failure of lack of controls and systems to keep up with the changes and risk of the plan. And that is a growing tension today, is to really put in internal controls that are adjusted to the risk of the current situation. There's where the problems are because of the complexity of business. Number 5, you've got to take a look at your own board of directors. You need a collegial board, and you're going to need a diversified board. You need a board that fosters debate, but with collegiality. You need a board that encourages candor. You need to identify the key experiences and expertise needed to match the demands of the business plan and the long-term strategy. What often happens, we get on boards and we're there too long. And we've got to constantly reevaluate ourselves. And board evaluation does that. And what I mean by board evaluation, I don't mean filling out forms checking whether or not the agendas are broad enough or you get enough information for management and board books are delivered on time. It's got to be more peer-to-peer. You've got to look at each other and say, are we asking the right questions? Are we coming from the right place? Because those are the pressures you need to have. Number 6, build a good record. For Pete's sakes, build a good record of what you're deliberating about. And please be careful about emails. I can tell you that today there is so much transparency and so much openness that unless you come to grips with that at the boardroom, it is going to suppress candor. And it's going to cause sidebars. And it's going to cause different debates. And there's a fractionalization that is going on in the boardrooms because of trying to understand what a good record is and focus on that. It's important, of course, to get good advisors, but you can't abdicate responsibility to them. Number 7, if you're going to use special committees, do it right. I think there's a tendency that every time there's a conflict in the boardroom or a crisis, we got to go form a special committee. What's that about? If we have a board that's working, you should only use a special committee if you have a specific conflict or issue of independence you've got to deal with. Because once you form a committee, it has a life of its own. And not every committee must demand having independent advisors. It really depends upon the situation. We are overlaying so much process into the boardroom, trying to walk the fine line of being correct and being independent, that we're losing sight, that we're killing process substantively. And you know you've seen that. Use committees carefully. There's a place for them, but they can get out of whack. Number 8. Be sensitive about shareholder activism. To me, the vocal minority is really going to be the vocal majority. Activism is not a bad thing in this new world. Activism is the constituency of the shareholders that you have to listen to and pay attention to, and who are going to vote you in or vote you out. And activism is getting smarter. A lot of activists I deal with do their homework. Believe me, they understand some of these strategic plans, and they have lots of followers. It's not hard to be an activist today. You couple majority voting and broker non-votes with an activist that holds 5 to 6 to 7% with a bunch of derivatives and synthetics, and they're very careful about not forming groups because of the disclosure obligations, but they have followers. You've got 20 to 25% of your stock in the hands of someone that's got something to say. And I think you've got to be aware of that, and you've got to deal with it, and it is not the enemy at the gate. It's a constituency that you've got to listen to and deal with, but don't throw the towel on. Number 9, clearly understand when and how to use structural defensive measures. Defensive measures are important. I may be in a minority, but I believe in them. Because if you stop and think about it, if your job is to build long-term value, and if you really have done your job in understanding the risk-adjusted discount value of that plan, you've got an obligation to defend against a short-term value creation that jeopardizes the long-term value. You can't be passive. That's not your job. And so there is a time and place for defensive measures, but you just don't put them in to put them in. You don't put in a poison pill that has a term of 10 years. Because your horizon on your strategic plan may only be 1 year. I've put in pills recently that have a duration sometimes of only 12 months. Because you're going to have to dialogue with the institutions. And there's going to be more transparency. And you're going to have to say to them, look, it's in. It's in for a short duration. I'll tell you why. There's a threat posed to what we've got to get done, and we're going to protect against that threat. It's not there for entrenchment. Don't ignore defensive measures, although you're going to be behind the 8 ball on them, but there's a place for them. But they have to be balanced, and they have to address the current situation. And lastly, my last comment is be bold, take chances, embrace some risk, do great things as a director. The law is not designed to trap you. To the contrary, its aim is to give you the freedom of action you need to take. The business judgment rule is sound. It still works. And all of these changes I've talked about, the changing landscape in governance, the tensions in the boardroom, the practical do's and don'ts, the fact of the matter is, director liability has not increased. What's increased is director accountability. Don't confuse liability with accountability. The worst thing we can do is avoid risk. All of these changes require an entrepreneurialism in the boardroom, because if you don't have it, the shareholders are going to force it on you in one form or the other. Well, look, those are my comments this morning. A lot of this I think you know, you've heard. I hope I put it in perspective. I really thank you for listening, and have a great session here. Thank you very much. Be glad to take some, we got time for some questions. Be glad to have any, if you do. Yes, thank you.
Is the re-election of the board can be compared as to evaluation?
Is the
Re-election of the board, because many boards has been elected like 1 in 3 years. Is it being considered as a part of re-evaluation of the members of the board?
I think it is. I think if I understand the question, re-election of the board is constantly debated. It's becoming more individual-oriented. You know, you put up board slates, but what I am finding is boards are taking a look at dealing with tenure and terms more. What is interesting is we used to be focused on age limits and terms and whatnot. I find that going away, quite frankly. The best argument for a term limit is it forces boards to deal with re-election and tenure. Well, thank you very much. Have a good session. Bye-bye.